The American Revolution and its effects on modern society. Back in the early 1760s, the British colonies that occupied the eastern seaboard of the United States had been stretched thin. Their taxes had been increased, and acts had been put in place to stop their trade. By the early 1770s, the colonists were fed up with paying for England's debts, which prompted the saying, "No taxation without representation." This, along with other atrocities during the time period, led to the signing of one of the most important documents in United States history, the Declaration of Independence. The Founding Fathers knew the risk of signing the document, but proceeded anyway, in an act of courage only seen in a select few political figures since. There were several main events that dominoed into what we call the American Revolution. On February 10th, 1763, the French and Indian War came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, but left many lasting effects. While triumphant, the war had badly stressed Britain's finances and caused the nation to plunge into debt. In an effort to minimize their financial burdens, England began exploring various options of raising revenues in the colonies. This, as you may imagine, resulted in higher taxes and higher tariffs on goods from outside of the country. Many new taxes were created, such as the sugar tax, which struck the colonists during an economic downturn, as well as the Stamp Act, which required any printed material in the colonies be produced on a special paper provided by London. The second main reason was the Proclamation of 1763, which forbid any colonists from moving past the Appalachian Mountains. Some historians argue that the Proclamation of 1763 furthered the divide between the mother country of England and the colonies in the United States. As tensions regarding colonial land and taxation increased during the 1760s and 1770s, many American leaders were influenced by the liberal and Republican ideals exposed by enlightened writers such as John Locke. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall on February 5, 1774. The idea of such a meeting was advanced a year earlier by Benjamin Franklin, but failed to gain much support until the port of Boston was closed in response to the Boston Tea Party. The Congress, which continued in session until late October, did not advocate independence. It sought rather to right the wrongs that had been inflicted on the colonies and hoped that a united voice would gain them a hearing in London. In the Second Continental Congress, the debate over independence became heated. In the debate over independence, John Adams, Richard Lee, and George Wythe argued in favor of independence and stated that the colonies, in fact, were already independent from Britain, only two colonies were still debating over the issue, and countries such as Spain and France were willing to help them gain their independence. On the other side of the argument, James Wilson, Robert Livingston, and John Dixon argued that, in fact, most of the middle colonies were not yet ready for independence, terms of governing were not set up yet, and they needed time to deal with Britain's military force. John Dickinson later went on to write The Radicalism of the American Revolution, and in it explains that the American Revolution was nothing but a treasonous act of the most despicable kind. John Dickinson was not alone on his views. A delegate from Maryland named Samuel Chase believed very much along the same lines as John Dickinson, only with a slight twist. Chase saw nothing treasonous about one nation wanting independence from another. To Chase, the reason why not to declare independence was due to the fear that the backwater, ill-prepared colonial army under the direction of George Washington had little or no chance against the highly trained forces of Great Britain. In a speech by Chase, the views of many were summed up into a few words. Maryland would welcome independence if it were given, but is highly skeptical that it could be taken. Samuel Chase's skepticism of the colonial army's success in the Revolutionary War was not so far off. For its third delegate to the Second Continental Congress, Pennsylvania chose Judge James Wilson, a naturally worried man who often felt uncomfortable around people. Wilson found safety in the policies of John Dixon. Although he himself had no direct opinion of independence from Britain, he knew all too well as a man of the law what the punishment would be if the quest for independence failed. During the Revolutionary War, Britain had an army of nearly 320,000 men, while the colonies, on the other hand, only had about 150,000. Following several years of rising tensions and the occupation of Boston by British troops, the military governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, began efforts to secure the colony's military supplies to keep them from the Patriot militias. These actions received official sanction on April 14, 1775, when orders arrived from London commanding him to disarm the militia and arrest key colonial leaders. Believing the militias to be hoarding supplies at Concord, Gage made plans to part his military to march and occupy the town. On April 16th, Gage sent a scouting party out of the city towards Concord, which gathered intelligence but also alerted the colonials to British intentions. Aware of Gage's orders, many key colonial figures such as John Hancock and Samuel Adams left Boston to seek safety in the country, as well as move supplies to different locations. This ultimately was the start of the American Revolution. On March 1st, 1781, the Continental Congress ratified the Articles of Confederation, which officially established a new government for the former colonies. Originally drafted in mid-1777, Congress had been operating on the Articles since the time. Designed to increase cooperation between the states, the Articles empowered Congress to make war, mint coins, resolve issues with the Western territories, and negotiate diplomatic agreements. With a defeat at Yorktown, support for the war in Britain declined greatly and ultimately forced Prime Minister Lord North to resign in March 1782. That year, the British government entered into peace negotiations with the United States. The American commissioners included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Henry Lawrence, and John Jay. While initial talks were inconclusive, a breakthrough was achieved in September, and a preliminary treaty was finalized in late November. While Parliament expressed unhappiness with some of the terms, the final document, the Treaty of Paris, was signed on September 3, 1783. With their lack of men and supplies, the colonists' chances of winning were very slim, and the Founding Fathers knew that. By the end of the war, nearly 50,000 colonial men were killed or injured, while the British suffered nearly 50% more, almost 75,000. Even with a large amount of casualties on both sides, the colonial army had succeeded in what many people believed to be impossible. They defeated the British army and successfully secured their independence. Today, most congressmen and women are like Judge James Wilson back in the Continental Congress. They are willing to go along with the group instead of make their own decisions. No one wants to propose anything radical because of the way people will remember them. They need to put aside their worries of how people will see them in 100 years and actually get stuff done. There have only been a few select people in history that have proposed anything extremely radical. Theodore Roosevelt, with his ideas of economic reform, Abraham Lincoln in the freeing of the slaves, and the Founding Fathers, who proposed the creation of our own government over the crown of tyranny. Thanks to the amazing courage the Founding Fathers had, with no regard to their own safety, they plunged into a war with very little odds of success, so the future of the nation would be a prosperous one.
And there was General Washington upon a slapping stallion, giving orders to his men. I guess there was a million. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, and with the girls be handy. A long war then we fought and won, the British were defeated, and Yankee Doodle was the march to which their troops retreated. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step, up, go!